Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about a neighbor who built 3 swimming pools on my land. Stepping off that cruise ship, I had that typical post-vacation glow, relaxed and ready to catch up on all the day-to-day routines I'd left behind. My phone had been off for the better part of 2 weeks, except for a few fleeting moments of connectivity at international ports. As you might guess, I was blissfully unaware of any issues back home. No frantic voicemails, no urgent texts. The last thing I expected was to find not 1, not 2, but 3 brand new swimming pools built on my property without my knowledge or permission. Even more startling, they were constructed by my next-door neighbor Byron, who insisted that I had given him the go-ahead to do so. Talk about a homecoming bombshell. I remember pulling into my driveway and thinking I must have gone delirious from a 15-hour flight. 3 large in-ground pools shimmered in the sun, all neatly lined up along the far edge of my lawn. One of them was practically the size of a hotel pool, complete with diving boards, a shallow kiddie section, and even poolside deck chairs. Another had a curved design and a built-in hot tub. The last one was slightly more modest, but still took up considerable square footage. All 3 were obviously brand new installations. Clean tiles, fresh landscaping, still untouched pool water that looked like it had just been poured out of a giant water truck. My house has always been my pride and joy. It's a 2-story place tucked away at the end of a cul-de-sac. I'd been saving every spare dollar for years to buy a property with extra land, simply because I enjoy privacy and the prospect of gardening and outdoor gatherings. My property line is well marked. I have a fence and even some surveyor's markers, courtesy of a land survey I paid for when I first moved in. Everyone on the block knows which part is mine. So how, in the name of all that's logical, could someone think it was fine to roll in construction crews, dig up my backyard, install plumbing, pour concrete, and finish 3 entire pools in a matter of a couple of weeks? Initially, I was too stunned to be furious. I parked my car and just stared from the driver's seat, trying to ensure I was really seeing what I thought I was seeing. My mind couldn't process how such a large-scale project had taken place right under my nose. And that's when Byron, my next-door neighbor, came striding over like it was the most natural thing in the world. Before I even got a word out, he started rambling about how, "The guys did a great job, right? And you'll love these amenities." He kept on boasting that the tiles were top of the line, claiming I'd appreciate the deep end, and that the built-in hot tub in one of the pools was a real gem. Then he said something that completely set me off. "I hope you remember our chat. You said you didn't mind me building here since you'd be gone." My jaw dropped so fast it nearly hit the steering wheel. I said, "Excuse me, our chat? I have no idea what you're talking about. I never gave you permission to build anything on my property." That's when Byron's eyes narrowed. He didn't look flustered or apologetic, only vaguely annoyed that I was questioning him. He insisted we had some verbal agreement a few months back when I told him I was planning a cruise. According to him, I had casually said something like, "Feel free to take advantage of the backyard while I'm gone," which he took to mean apparently, "Please invest in 3 expensive pools and build them on my land." The sheer absurdity of his claim took me from shocked to angry in about 2 seconds flat. I told him there was no such permission, not even close. Yes, I'd mentioned to him in passing that I'd be away on a cruise, mostly because he was complaining about leaves from my trees blowing onto his property, and I casually said I wouldn't be around to help rake for a couple of weeks. But never in my wildest dreams did I think that might be interpreted as an invitation to break ground on a massive construction project. Byron shrugged and said that since it was a verbal agreement, I couldn't prove otherwise. It was the most entitled and brazen statement I'd ever heard from a neighbor. Once the initial shock wore off, reality set in. My yard was torn up, the grass was completely destroyed in the areas surrounding the pools, and newly laid concrete walkways snaked around each installation. Tools, leftover building materials, and scraps of construction debris cluttered the fence line. On top of everything else, the property lines had clearly been ignored because one of the pools encroached well over 5 feet into my yard, if you can even call it my yard at this point. But if that wasn't enough, the nerve of Byron's attitude left me with no doubt. This guy was planning to effectively seize part of my land. He insisted the property line was a suggestion, and that in many neighborhoods, neighbors share the land between them without making a fuss. I wanted to laugh in disbelief, but this was too serious. My property is my property. There's a literal fence. The idea of sharing was never part of the arrangement. I'm generally a calm person, but I was done. I demanded he remove the pools immediately. He told me I was being unreasonable. Apparently, he had already invited friends over for a barbecue the next weekend, and he suggested I get over it and join in. With each word he spoke, I felt my blood pressure rise another notch. In short, Byron intended to keep those pools where they were and expect me to be fine with it. He acted like I was the one who was irrational, that I should be grateful for these home improvements. My immediate reaction was to call the police and see if I could file some sort of trespassing or property damage report. But property disputes often need to go through civil courts. Nonetheless, calling the police was my first step. The officer who arrived took a bunch of notes and looked just as bewildered as I felt. But he explained that while it was clearly a property rights issue, it might become a civil matter. He did caution Byron to tread carefully because he was in a major legal gray zone, but the officer couldn't just tell him to tear everything down on the spot. Without hesitation, I dialed my attorney next. I have a family friend, Gwen, who's a lawyer. She specializes in real estate and general civil litigation, which was perfect for my predicament. When I described my situation, Gwen was initially stunned into a long pause. Then she slowly asked me to confirm every detail. Once she realized I wasn't exaggerating or messing with her, she told me we had an almost certain case of trespass and damage to property. She recommended taking detailed photos, getting contractor estimates for the cost of removing these pools, and gathering any evidence, like land surveys, that proved exactly where my property line lay. She also told me not to communicate with Byron further except through official channels, because if he tried to claim any kind of verbal agreement, anything I said might be twisted. Now here's where the story took its first surprising twist. A couple of days later, while I was busy taking pictures of everything for documentation, I saw Byron out on his deck, on the phone, clearly upset. I overheard bits and pieces. "I need your help to prove it, and you said we were good," followed by, "Yes, I know it's not on my side." He was talking to someone he'd presumably told about the so-called verbal permission. As it turns out, Byron might have tried to get some buddy of his to back up his version of events. In the days that followed, I received a typed letter in my mailbox, poorly spelled, stating that I had agreed to let Byron construct some improvements on the border of our properties. The letter was signed by a person named Victor, someone I'd never met. The entire thing looked beyond shady. I passed it on to Gwen, who responded with a single sentence: "This attempt at forging evidence is laughable." Meanwhile, my yard was still a disaster zone. Rain was forecast for the weekend, and I had concerns about water drainage from these pools. I'd already had a professional opinion that if the drainage wasn't set up correctly, the water might seep into my basement. I'd also discovered that Byron's construction team had messed with one of my existing drainage pipes that carried water away from my property. My frustration mounted. It wasn't just the arrogance of building on my land. He'd also put my home at risk for potential water damage. I tried to keep calm and follow Gwen's advice. She suggested I compile an itemized list of damages. This list included the cost to remove the pools, re-landscape my yard, repair or replace my fence, which Byron's crew had apparently unbolted in sections to bring in heavy equipment, and address any structural issues caused by altered drainage. She also recommended I note any emotional distress or nuisance created by the loud construction and the short-notice intrusion. The figure ballooned into the tens of thousands of dollars. Then came the next step. We served Byron with a letter stating our intent to sue if he didn't remove the pools and pay for damages immediately. I tried to hand-deliver it, but Byron refused to open the door. I ended up mailing it via certified mail to cover all bases. A day later, Byron slid a hand-scrawled note under my front door that essentially read, "You can't force me to remove something you allowed me to build. This is your last warning. Drop it or pay for removal yourself." He ended it with some vague reference to how neighbors should support each other, as though my standing up for my legal rights was an act of betrayal. At that point, I was done trying to reason. The lawsuit moved forward swiftly thanks to Gwen's expertise. While the wheels of justice started turning, a parallel drama was unfolding. My friend Tasha, who lives on the next block, witnessed Byron hosting multiple pool parties, sometimes even during the weekdays, inviting large groups of people over. The guests would park along our cul-de-sac, occasionally blocking my driveway, and then wander into the backyard as if it belonged to them. I'd get back from running errands and find a half-dozen cars scattered around, some almost up against my garage door. I confronted one of Byron's guests who seemed sober enough to talk rationally, explaining that my driveway wasn't a public parking zone. He blinked at me in confusion, then waved a dismissive hand as if to say, "It's not a big deal." It added insult to injury that these parties were happening on pools that were illegally built on my property. Sometimes it felt like a surreal dream. How could anyone be so brazen? The final straw came when one of Byron's rowdy get-togethers led to major noise complaints from several neighbors. The police arrived and found out the property in question was actually mine, which added another layer of complications. I began receiving warnings from the Homeowners Association about the noise, even though it wasn't my party. That same week, I discovered footprints of muddy shoes trampled across my patio, plus a cracked planter. I recognized the footprints were probably from intoxicated guests stumbling around my backyard. I snapped photos, documented the damages, and added them to our growing case file. A few weeks went by. Gwen served Byron official court papers, listing not only trespass but also property damage, nuisance, and various other claims that fit the situation perfectly. Byron had the audacity to file a response where he still insisted I had given him verbal permission. He provided that odd typed letter with Victor's name as backup. He added a new twist, claiming that I'd verbally told him we could share the entire backyard, so he was only using his fair share, which he was nice enough to upgrade with pools. In his version of reality, he hadn't stolen land. He was simply beautifying shared space. Let me tell you, reading those statements was like venturing into a parallel universe of nonsense. As the court date approached, Byron's attitude took a bizarre turn. He started leaving me voice messages, which I saved, in which he swung between threatening and pleading. One day he'd say, "You'll never win this and you'll end up paying me for defamation." The next day he'd say, "Let's settle this like neighbors. Maybe you can just cover half the cost of the pools and we'll call it even." He truly believed I should fork over money for the pools I never wanted. I politely declined via Gwen every single time. Friends and family rallied around me. My sister, Marissa, flew in for moral support. She was appalled at Byron's boldness, especially when we discovered that he'd spent a lot of money on these pools. He hired a specialized contractor known for speedy pool installations. That's how he managed to get them built in just a couple of weeks while I was gone. The total cost must have been substantial, and he clearly hoped to pass that bill on to me. It was puzzling. Did he really think any judge would side with him on such an outrageous claim? Right before the first court hearing, I got another glimpse into Byron's life that shed some light on his motivations. A different neighbor mentioned overhearing Byron brag that he planned to list his house for sale soon. The presence of 3 professionally installed in-ground pools adjacent to his property, which he could photograph in real estate listings as though they were part of his yard, would potentially boost his home's attractiveness. Maybe he thought a prospective buyer would see the amenities and be willing to pay top dollar. Then Byron could simply ditch the property and leave me with the mess. It explained a lot. This was never about a misunderstanding or some misguided sense of friendly yard sharing. He was trying to cash in and skip town. When the court date arrived, I dressed up in a suit and tie, feeling both anxious and confident. Gwen had prepared meticulously, with photographs, official land surveys, and even statements from neighbors who witnessed the construction crews entering my property. Byron showed up in wrinkled slacks, looking rattled, and clutching some folders that seemed barely organized. His lawyer, from what I could tell, was a general practice attorney who looked uneasy about the entire situation. It didn't help Byron's case that as soon as we began, the judge asked him for any written contract or document proving my supposed permission. Byron stammered something about verbal understanding. The judge pressed him repeatedly. "Did you get anything in writing?" Byron answered no. "Did you get any approval from the county for building the pools on your neighbor's property?" Again, no. "Do you have any documentation from the homeowner confirming your right to construct anything on their land?" Once more, no. The typed letter from Victor was dismissed almost immediately because it was unnotarized, unsubstantiated, and from an individual not even present to testify. Gwen showcased the property lines along with the survey I had done years ago, which made it crystal clear that all 3 pools were entirely within my property boundaries. She also pointed out the damage done to my yard, fence, and drainage. We included estimates from multiple contractors detailing the cost of removing the pools and fixing the property. The judge's expression grew increasingly disapproving as Byron tried to justify his actions. He spouted nonsense about how neighbors in some states allow open land usage if it's not actively being used, but he had no credible citations, no relevant laws, no witness testimony, just baseless claims. During one particularly eye-opening moment, the judge asked Byron if he had any reason to believe that I, as the property owner, was incompetent, under duress, or otherwise unable to provide or deny consent. Byron hemmed and hawed before admitting, "Well, no, I just thought it was going to be okay because we'd get along better if we shared." The judge's gaze turned icy. Even Byron's own lawyer looked like he wanted to hide. It became obvious Byron was playing a risky game, hoping intimidation or confusion would push me to let it slide. The judge ruled in my favor unequivocally. Not only did the court order Byron to remove the pools at his expense, but I was awarded hefty damages. The ruling specified that Byron had to compensate me for all costs associated with restoring my land to its prior condition. On top of that, the court granted me additional compensation equivalent to the full cost of building 4 brand new pools of the same quality, presumably because of the blatant trespass, willful property damage, and the enormous headache he'd caused. It was a massive financial blow to Byron. Essentially, I ended up with 3 pools, because the judge decided to let me choose whether I wanted them removed or transferred to me, with Byron footing the bill for any potential upkeep or modifications, and enough compensation to construct 4 more if I so desired. The judge recognized that the pools themselves might have salvage value, or I could tear them out. The point was that Byron had no right to them once they were deemed illegally built on my property. If I decided to keep them, the judge believed it was only fair for me to be compensated for ongoing maintenance or the intangible costs of the intrusion. This outcome was astonishing even to me. I'd expected the court to order removal or compensation, but not both. Byron stood there as pale as a sheet when he heard the decision. I almost felt pity, but then I recalled the months of stress he'd caused and the arrogance he displayed. That sympathy evaporated in a heartbeat. After the ruling, Byron tried to appeal. He claimed the compensation was excessive. His appeal got nowhere. The appellate judge affirmed the lower court's decision, indicating that Byron's actions were so far outside any reasonable boundary that the ruling was justified. Not surprisingly, Byron's finances took a nosedive trying to cover the legal fees, the damages awarded to me, and the cost of removing or surrendering the pools. He delayed paying for a while, which forced me to place a lien on his property. Ultimately, as part of a settlement, I agreed not to enforce the lien immediately if he transferred the title of all the pools to me and paid a portion of the damages up front with a structured plan to pay the rest over time. That allowed me some measure of relief knowing I'd eventually receive my money, one way or another. Byron's fiasco didn't end there. The local homeowners association got wind of the fiasco. They slapped him with multiple violation notices related to unauthorized construction, noise complaints, and failure to adhere to community guidelines about property lines. There were even rumors he might face local municipal fines because the construction permits he used were apparently riddled with inaccuracies. He had listed the construction site address as his own property, but never clarified that the actual digging was happening on my land. That alone could be considered a serious violation. I heard from another neighbor that the county considered taking legal action or issuing fines, though I'm not sure exactly how that panned out. Here's another twist. Once I legally owned the pools, I had the freedom to decide their fate. I considered removing them altogether, simply to restore my yard to what it was before this fiasco. However, I recognized a potential benefit. While it was never my plan to have a swimming pool, let alone 3, there's no question that properly maintained in-ground pools can be a fun asset. After consulting with friends, family, and a reputable contractor, I decided to keep one of the pools, the largest one with the hot tub. It was fairly well designed and could be integrated nicely into my backyard if I replaced some of the surrounding concrete with landscaping more to my taste. The other 2, I had them removed. The removal costs, of course, were fully covered by the settlement with Byron. The leftover space was turned back into lawn and a garden patch. The major question was how to handle the monetary award. With the kind of cash that came in from the settlement, equivalent to building 4 brand new pools, I had a variety of options. I used some of it to pay off my mortgage earlier than planned, which felt amazing. I also repaired the fence, resodded the yard, and installed a lovely wooden deck near the single pool I kept. Some leftover funds went into a rainy day account. In a strange way, Byron's invasion of my property ended up speeding up my financial freedom. I guess that's poetic justice. Throughout this ordeal, Byron's behavior became increasingly erratic. His frustration was palpable. On 2 occasions, I caught him glaring at me from his deck. Once, he actually started muttering under his breath when I parked my car and walked toward my front door. I suspect he was cursing me for standing up for myself, but I never engaged him in conversation after the lawsuit. I didn't see the point. The legal outcome was definitive, and I wanted to minimize contact. Eventually, Byron's house went on the market. Whether he was forced to sell because he needed the money to pay off debts or he simply wanted to flee the scene of his embarrassment, I can't say for sure. But the for sale sign appeared about 3 months after the final settlement was reached. According to rumors, prospective buyers were uneasy about the property's history, especially because he had misrepresented so much to get the pools built in the first place. On top of that, the listing photos couldn't even show any pool in his yard because those pools no longer belonged to him or had been removed, aside from the one I kept, which was clearly on my side of the fence. One of my neighbors, Roberta, told me there was an open house with barely any attendees. I can't confirm if that's accurate, but it seemed plausible. There was also another layer of drama brewing. Apparently, Byron's father had co-signed his mortgage originally. When the father discovered the extent of Byron's wrongdoing, he was furious. On a couple of occasions, I saw a much older man outside Byron's front door, yelling about irresponsible behavior and how could you jeopardize our family's investment? That kind of meltdown can't be easy. And while I feel a twinge of sympathy for the father, none of this changes the fact that Byron tried to profit from something he had zero right to. Another side plot that complicated matters was Byron's ex-partner, Lorelei. She had moved out a year earlier, but her name was still on some shared assets. Lorelei reached out to me once, apologizing for Byron's behavior. She told me she'd never been more relieved to cut ties with him. She also worried about any lingering liability from the lawsuit. But since the court order explicitly assigned blame and damages to Byron alone, Lorelei was off the hook. Still, it was a headache for her, as she had to appear in some of the court proceedings to confirm that she was no longer a co-owner of the house. She described Byron's sense of entitlement in chilling detail, how he'd always wanted the biggest, best things, yet never wanted to pay fairly or follow any rules. She felt validated that a court had finally forced him to face consequences. In a weird twist, the local community watchers, some older residents who liked to gossip, started spinning stories about the great pool heist in the neighborhood. Some claimed Byron had done something similar in a previous town, though that might be just rumors. Others were certain Byron had been heavily in debt and was looking for a quick fix by artificially inflating his property value. Regardless of what the truth was behind his finances, the reality was that Byron shot himself in the foot. He could have just left me alone, or if he truly wanted to share a pool, he could have approached me with a respectful proposition. Instead, he tried to trample my rights. He ended up facing a humiliating court loss and crippling debt. Long after the dust settled, I found myself floating on a pool raft in what was once Byron's largest luxury addition, sipping a cold beverage, gazing at the stars in the sky, and thinking how surreal it all was. If anyone had told me a year earlier that I'd end up with a custom pool, a refurbished backyard, and a chunk of money thanks to my neighbor's outrageous sense of entitlement, I would have laughed them off. But life is unpredictable. When you stand your ground to protect your rights and have a dedicated lawyer on speed dial, sometimes justice not only prevails, but hands you a windfall in the process. Even though the final outcome was positive, I don't want to pretend it was an easy ride. The months of litigation were stressful, the uncertainty weighed on me, and the entire experience left me more cautious about trusting neighbors. I installed security cameras, not just for general property surveillance, but also to ensure there were no future attempts at neighborly improvements. On the bright side, I've become much more knowledgeable about property law and local ordinances. That knowledge might come in handy if I ever run into boundary disputes again. It was also interesting to see how supportive most of my neighbors were once they learned the full story. Initially, some had only heard Byron's version, in which I was supposedly petty or uncooperative. But as soon as they saw the evidence or heard the official details, they realized I was in the right. A few of them even attended parts of the court hearings to offer moral support. One neighbor, Phil, told me afterward, "I never liked that Byron guy. He always struck me as the type who'd push his luck. I'm glad you took him down a peg." Phil was usually mild-mannered, So that statement spoke volumes about the effect Byron's personality had on people. One unexpected side benefit of the fiasco is that I've become more connected with the neighbors who are genuinely good people. Tasha, for example, lives a block away, and we didn't interact much beyond friendly waves. But after she stood by me as a witness to Byron's parties and we realized we got along well, we started hanging out more. That sense of community has been a nice silver lining. Sometimes adversity brings folks together. Before Byron finally moved out, he tried one last time to talk to me directly, cornering me in the driveway to propose a private settlement. He offered me a fraction of the amount awarded by the court, hoping I'd accept it in lieu of monthly payments. I politely told him that I trusted the legal process. He then resorted to threatening that if I didn't take his deal, I might not see all the money he owed me. I reminded him that a lien was in place on his property and that if he didn't follow the structured payment plan, the lien would be enforced and the courts could seize assets as needed. That ended the conversation pretty quickly. There was no more room for intimidation. Ultimately, Byron sold his house at a loss, likely because potential buyers were wary of the legal entanglements. The new owners moved in about 6 months ago, and they seem like perfectly pleasant people. They've been quite respectful of property boundaries, and I made a point of introducing myself. I gave them a brief, sanitized version of what happened, mostly to reassure them that I hold no ill will. They seemed relieved to start fresh in a home without any leftover drama. All said and done, I'm still a bit stunned by how it all played out. The transformation from victim to victor with a pool was a roller coaster. I remain convinced that one of the biggest mistakes Byron made, beyond the obvious violation, was underestimating my willingness to defend my property. He probably assumed I'd cave to intimidation or see the hassle of going to court as too big to handle. It's a lesson in how sometimes the biggest bullies crumble when you actually fight back. And fight back I did, armed with evidence, a good lawyer, and a refusal to let someone walk all over me. Life has returned to a calm normal now, with the occasional pool party hosted by me. For friends and family I actually invite. I can't say I'm a huge swimming enthusiast, but having the option to lounge by a pool on a hot summer day is undeniably pleasant. I often think of it as Byron's accidental gift to me, though a gift he never intended to give. And while it's a strange story to recount to new acquaintances, I keep it as a reminder that no matter how bizarre or blatant someone's trespass might be, the law is there to protect you, especially when you can prove the wrongdoing as clearly as I could. Friends, thank you. See you soon.